we're talking about getting people through this crisis. We're now introducing one single benefit, the Canadian Emergency Benefit, to help workers who have lost their income because of the pandemic. Be you eligible for EI or not, this benefit is there to help you. People will receive $2,000 from the federal government every month for the next 4 months. We'll be launching an online portal as quickly as possible so that you can make your application as quickly as possible and get money in the next 10 days.
Yesterday, our plan to help Canadians save jobs and support our economy was adopted by Parliament. With more generous measures to help even more Canadians, we're now talking about $107 billion to support people and businesses. We launched the new Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which will provide $2,000 a month for up to 4 months to people who are not getting paid as a result of COVID-19. This will replace the 2 benefits we announced last week to make it even simpler for you to get help. An application portal will launch as quickly as possible, and people should start receiving money within 14 days of applying. As part of this plan, we'll also be boosting the Canada Child Benefit for families in May. Parents already know how much the CCB helps with the cost of raising kids. By increasing the CCB, we'll put even more money in the pockets of families to help them navigate these uncertain times. We'll also be supplementing the GST credit, which is sent to low-income Canadians every few months. And for people who are still paying off their student loans, we're putting a 6-month interest-free moratorium on their Canada student loans. You can find more information on what else we're doing and how to access your benefits at canada.ca. I'm sorry to say there appears to be a text scam going around on the new emergency response benefit. I want to remind everyone that the government's website is the best place to find reliable information on everything we're doing. Vous pouvez consulter le site canada.ca.
You can consult the canada.ca site to get more information on what our government is doing to deal with COVID-19, on the way you can get your benefits. Unfortunately, some people have received a text message, which appeared to come from the government about the new emergency benefit. It's a scam. I'd just like to remind you that the government's website is the best place to get reliable information on what we're doing. It's clear that the pandemic is putting a lot of pressure on our healthcare system, on EI, and on all of government machinery. But you must know that we're doing everything we can to reduce delays. I know that bills are piling up for people and pressure is building. Many families are worried, and they're right to be worried. But we're working as quickly as possible to put money in your pockets as quickly as possible. We also know that people abroad are finding it tough to find flights to get home to Canada, and we're continuing to work with airlines to bring them home. Yesterday, Air Transat announced 2 other flights from El Salvador and Guatemala going to Montreal. At the same time, our government is in ongoing communication with our international partners who are also facing the crisis themselves. We're looking at what has worked and what's not worked for them, and we're trying to see whether we can tap into their success in some cases.
G20 leaders. One thing is clear. We can only overcome COVID-19 if we take action together as a global community. So we're going to do whatever it takes. That means making sure the World Health Organization and our public health agencies have the resources they need. It means working together to develop a vaccine, identify treatments, and increase testing. We're also expanding manufacturing capacity for critical medical equipment and working to keep the supply chains moving to get that equipment to the people who need it. Our government is helping companies in Canada retool their manufacturing facilities to produce the things we all need. On the economy, the G20 has also made significant investments to help people and businesses get through this challenging time. And we're going to be working closely together to coordinate our efforts to protect the global economy. COVID-19 is a global crisis and demands a global response. Now, more than ever, we must work with our allies to protect people and the economy. And on that note, I announced this morning that I'm appointing Kirsten Hillman as our new ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Hillman is a gifted and brilliant diplomat. She was instrumental in securing a good deal for Canada and for Canadians during NAFTA negotiations. Most recently, Ambassador Hillman played a key role as we worked with our southern neighbors to temporarily close the border while keeping trade flowing. As we fight COVID-19, we must protect the supply chains on which we depend for things like fresh vegetables, medicine, and supplies for our healthcare systems. Our ports, railways, and trucks are vital to bringing in the things we need, and I want to thank all the workers who are keeping our country moving. Every day, our government looks at what we need to do better to help you and keep you safe from this evolving crisis. So in response to the fact that too many travelers are still not self-isolating upon returning to Canada, we're taking greater action. I've been very clear on this. The premiers, Dr. Tam, and public health officials have all been very clear on this. If you've just returned from abroad, you have to go home and stay home for 14 days. But some people have not been taking this seriously. They're stopping by the grocery store on their way home from the airport. They're getting together with friends after being away for March break. This kind of conduct is not just disappointing, it's dangerous. So now, a 14-day quarantine will be mandatory for all Canadians returning home from abroad. We are implementing the Quarantine Act to keep all Canadians safe. If you do not comply with these instructions, you could face serious fines and even prison time. C'est absolument essentiel que tous les voyageurs se placent en quarantaine.
It's absolutely essential that all travellers returning to Canada go into quarantine for 14 days when they come back to Canada. We've been repeating this message for weeks, but some people don't seem to be taking our recommendations seriously. It's not only disappointing, it's also dangerous. Therefore, we'll be making self-isolation obligatory, compulsory through the Quarantine Act. If you refuse to follow these measures, you could be liable to a huge fine or even jail time in some circumstances. We all have a role to play to break the spread of the disease. What we're asking you to do is not complicated. Just stay at home. Wash your hands. Keep your distance. Call your friends rather than going to see them. And above all, if you're coming back from a trip, you cannot in any circumstances leave the house for 14 days. We're all looking forward to life getting back to normal, but if we're to achieve that, everyone has to do their bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. La première question nous vient de Michel Lamarche.
First question from Michel Lamarche, TVA News. You have the floor. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to hear you tell us a bit more about the safety equipment, the protective equipment that was sent to China in February. Could you explain today why you decided to do that, because it appears now that there's a great shortage in many provinces today. This is a global pandemic and it requires a global response. Canada fully understands that helping others is a way of helping ourselves, but I'd like to reassure Canadians today we've always been able to meet the needs of provinces in terms of protective equipment in the provinces, and in the coming days we'll be receiving millions of extra items, extra equipment, extra medical supplies as well, so that we can meet all needs across the country. We're also seeing that Canadian companies are manufacturing solutions and equipment. We will have the necessary equipment to keep people safe while still stepping up to the plate across the world as well. This is a global crisis.
Very beginning, that this is a global crisis that requires global cooperation and response if we are to keep all of us safe and if we are to keep Canadians safe. At the same time, I can assure everyone that the federal stockpiles have been sufficient to meet the needs of the provinces until this point. And in the coming days, we will be receiving millions more items that are necessary right across the country, at the same time as our businesses, companies, and manufacturers are tooling up production to make sure that we have enough, not just for Canadians, but for friends and allies around the world who need it.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, Hélène Buzetti du Devoir.
Next question, Hélène Buzetti from the Devoir. You have the floor. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to pick up on your bill that gave you spending and taxing powers until December 2021. You have explained why your government thinks it needs that flexibility to deal with the pandemic, but you've never explained why you think you'll need these powers for so long. Could you explain the reason why you wanted those powers until December 2021? Well, as you know, this is an unpredictable situation. It's something that the world economy has never experienced. We recognize that we need extraordinary measures to deal with this crisis. Our objective was to give the government the flexibility it needs to deal with this crisis. We don't know how long this crisis will go on for, but we've understood and we've worked with opposition parties on this, that the opposition parties had concerns. We worked to resolve those concerns, so we'll continue to work to make sure that the necessary steps are taken to protect Canadians. Next question. Thank you.
The next question is from David Ingram from Reuters, Ottawa. Please go ahead.
Yes. Good morning, Prime Minister. President Trump yesterday said he wants.
Sorry, David. I need you guys to raise the volume. I can't hear them.
Okay, sorry. Is that better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you, David.
All right. President Trump said yesterday that he wanted to reopen the U.S. economy by Easter. Mayors of border towns in Canada are telling us they are petrified by the idea of a whole bunch of Americans coming north, possibly with the virus. How concerned are you by his comments, and what are you going to do to stop this? Is there any way you can kind of put some sort of security presence on the border?
We will continue to work with the United States to ensure that the border measures we put in place are respected. We have closed the border temporarily to all but essential travelers, and we will continue to work with the American administration to ensure that we're doing everything we can to keep our country safe and to keep Canadians safe in our case. We will continue to adjust as things unfold as necessary, but we will be continuing to follow the best advice of the scientific community on doing what is necessary to keep Canadians safe as a priority.
Merci beaucoup. Dernière question au téléphone.
Thank you. Merci. The last question is from Bruce Campton-Smith from the Toronto Star. Please go ahead.
Prime Minister, good morning. Just wondering, why was the quarantine for travelers arriving from outside the country not made mandatory sooner? Before the March break, travelers came home, before the border was closed to all foreign travel. And are you worried that this delay may have contributed to the spread of the virus in Canada?
Right across the country, we've seen Canadians following the guidelines, taking very seriously the recommendations of public health agencies. We have seen people staying at home. We have seen people keeping 2 meters distant from each other. We've seen people engaged in hand washing and using hand sanitizer. We know that the vast majority of Canadians have been following the guidelines set out for their own protection and for the protection of all of us. Unfortunately, there are a number of people who have not been following the guidelines that are there for their protection, which is why we've had to take this next step of bringing in the Quarantine Act to ensure that Canadians who do not follow the instructions to self-quarantine for 14 days, self-isolate for 14 days immediately upon re-entering Canada, they will be facing fines and perhaps even jail time.
Merci beaucoup. On va maintenant passer aux journalistes ici.
Hi, Ashley Burke, CBC News. A week and a half ago, you told Canadians to come home. More than 1 million Canadians have since then. Can you tell me about the decision-making and the rationale behind waiting until now to make it mandatory to undergo a 14-day self-quarantine rather than a week and a half ago?
There was a requirement from the very beginning, instructions given to Canadians returning that they needed to self-isolate for 14 days. And many, many, many of them did. Canadians have been following the instructions and the rules and the guidelines set out by public health because they know it's about protecting their own safety, protecting that of their loved ones, and protecting the integrity and the health of people who work in our healthcare system. Unfortunately, there have been too many people who have not, and that's why we have to take this further step of making quarantine mandatory and bringing in enforcement measures as well.
And one of the challenges is enforcement with self-mandatory quarantine. Are you asking people to report if they see someone breaking the rules or the law?
Public health will be following up in many, many cases to ensure that people are following these rules, and enforcement will happen as enforcement does, as in various ways by our police and enforcement officers. Okay.
Well, we recognize that many people have actually followed the instructions. Health Canada will be following up with many people to ensure and to make sure that they are following the rules. They are self-isolating, and if people refuse to do that, well, we've seen several cases in the news where people have been arrested for not having followed the rules. That'll happen now. Mr. Trudeau, you're asking people to make sacrifices to do their bit. Why are you not asking large credit card companies to give a grace period to people whose cards are maxed out and who are continuing to pay interest? Don't you think it's something that they should be doing? Well, yes, it's a conversation we're having with the major banks across the country. I'd like to point out that Minister Morneau is in regular conversation with the banks. We're encouraging them to take measures like this one. At the same time, we're looking at taking steps to make credit access easier to Canadians, and of course that would be cheaper than credit card interest.
You that the finance minister has had conversations directly with the banks about credit card interest rates. We recognize that they are a significant challenge for many Canadians at this point. That is why we are encouraging them to take action to alleviate the burden for Canadians. At the same time as we are looking on our end at making credit more available and less expensive for Canadians to be able to make it through the next few months.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Janet Silver, Global News. Global News has learned that the Trump administration wants to have U.S. military troops stationed within 30 kilometers of the Canadian-U.S. border to cut back over fears with regards to COVID-19 and illegal border crossings. I want to know if you think this is necessary, and if you or any of your colleagues in your government had any discussions with the Trump administration about this.
Canada and the United States have the longest unmilitarized border in the world, and it is very much in both of our interests for it to remain that way. We have been in discussions with the United States on this. Well, Canada
and the U.S. have the longest non-militarized border in the world, and it's in our interests, in both our interests really, to keep it that way. We're currently in discussion with the U.S. on this issue.
Prime Minister,
Molly Thomas, CTV National News. Can you give us a little bit more clarity on that? I mean, what does it mean to have discussions on this, and what does this mean for Canada?
We have highlighted that the fact that the Canada-U.S. border is the longest unmilitarized border in the world is something that has benefited our two countries and our both economies tremendously, and we feel that it needs to remain that way.
I want to ask about, there's more than 30,000 cases alone in New York. That's a state that borders parts of Ontario and Quebec. Would we ever ban essential goods or people coming in specifically from that hotspot?
I think we will always take measures that are necessary to protect Canadians, as we've demonstrated. At the same time, we understand that part of protecting Canadians is ensuring a good supply of food, of medical supplies, of necessary equipment across our border. We will continue to look for ways to make sure we're keeping Canadians safe while providing us with the things we need.
Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Prime Minister, on your call with the G20 leaders today, was there any discussion or a decision made on the call from the UN for $2 billion in aid for developing countries to fight the coronavirus, including help with testing kits in Africa and other gear needed?
We talked about a number of things. We talked about the need for a coordinated global response. That is something that the G20 is particularly well suited to move forward on. We need to make sure that we're continuing to exchange information and align in the actions we take. We talked about the need to flatten the global curve of this pandemic, which means beyond just individual countries doing what's necessary for themselves, we need to work together to have an impact that goes beyond our borders. We talked about the need for global economic support for citizens, for businesses. The G20 represents 85% of the global GDP. We know that we have the capacity to stave off and to positively impact the economy at this time of significant stress. And so we pledged to work together. And we also talked about the need to help vulnerable countries that don't have either the science or the health systems to be able to keep their populations safe, including through investments through global organizations like the UN or the WHO or the World Bank. We also specifically talked about the challenges facing Africa and how we will be there to support Africa as they face this pandemic as well.
So does that mean that, the question was, is Canada and other countries actually sending money? And additionally, Saudi Arabia is the chair of the G20. Did the price war over oil prices come up, and what's happening there?
As I spoke about yesterday, we will be participating in international efforts to fight this virus. We know that support for vulnerable countries who are struggling with the ability to combat this virus is not just about being altruistic, it's about protecting Canadians as well. This virus will possibly face resurgences even once we've handled it in Canada and in many countries. Our ability to minimize those resurgences will be linked to our ability to help and work with countries in more dire situations.
Well, we recognize that helping in the international effort to deal with COVID-19, it's not just an issue of altruism, it's also something that's good for Canadians. We know that by preventing a resurgence of the virus, once we've got it under control in Canada, it could be stopped by concrete action in vulnerable countries. This is why we're taking part in the UN effort to help countries in distress.
All right, Peter Van Dusen watching along with you. Justin Trudeau with yet, you know what we didn't hear? With another address to Canadians and questions from reporters. We didn't hear, which we thought we might, we didn't hear the question on self-isolation, which by our count ends today. He's at the 14-day mark after his wife was tested, who tested positive for COVID-19. So he didn't get asked about that and whether he's going to stay in self-isolation at home, taking this kind of distancing measure, or whether he's going to resume a somewhat more normal routine of going to an office, or whether he's going to do what he has to do from there. Let's walk through some of the things we heard from Justin Trudeau today, and a couple of things that provided some clarity, and some other things that leave us with more questions here. And Martin Stringer and I watching along together here. And let's start with this relief package for Canadians that he talked about. And this idea, yesterday he was talking about April 6th to get a portal up and running, and then payments to people shortly after that. It sounded like there might have been a bit of a change in the language today.
Yesterday he specifically used the term 10 days. Now I'm not sure whether he was guaranteeing that these payments would be finished within 10 days, but he used the term 10 days today. He said within 14 days. So obviously there's different figures being invoked in terms of telling people how long it will take after they have actually filed for these for this Canada Emergency Response Benefits. Also an interesting point, and the Prime Minister went out of his way, so this is the leader of the country, went out of his way to point out that there is a scam going on right now, and that as people are receiving, and it's been journalists and some well-meaning people have pointed out and warned people about this scam. Emails and text messages have gone out across the country to Canadians, and they purport to be a notice that you have received this benefit. First of all, they don't get the name of the benefit right. Second of all, they don't get the amount of the benefit right. They say you've received $1,700 and something. And third of all, of course, the message to Canadians is that if you have not applied for it, you're not going to be eligible for it. The scam, these messages ask people to click on a website. It's obviously a dangerous scam, and it's interesting the Prime Minister even went out of his way to warn people about it.
Right. Said he told Canadians, look, the best way to deal with all this is to go to the Government of Canada website on this. So you won't be getting text messages from the government saying, hey, we got some money for you. Yeah. That won't happen. If you see it, it's a scam. But on this issue of timing, yesterday the Prime Minister was asked and was, had mentioned that April 6th as the date they hope to have this federal portal up and running. As you can see, we've got the box up now on our screen of where the federal cabinet ministers are expected to meet with reporters. Maybe there we'll get a little more detail about the how the government hopes to roll out this. But yesterday, Justin Trudeau was talking about April 6th to get a portal up and running. Very hopeful it could happen, and then within 10 days, payments would roll from there once people had applied at the portal. 10 days to get payments. Now, he didn't give a date of when they thought it would be up and running, just that they're working very hard to make it happen. And now we're hearing this 14 days. Within 14 days, people might get the money flowing to them. Also talked about want to go back and hear the quarantine. Some questions about why is the government only decided now is the time to make the quarantine for Canadians returning to this country mandatory, 14 days of self-isolation. When Canadians come back, it had been a request and a recommendation. Now it's more than that. It is a government order under the Quarantine Act. You are required to do it. Prime Minister was asked about that. Let's listen.
Hi, Ashley Burke, CBC News. A week and a half ago, you told Canadians to come home. More than 1 million Canadians have since then. Can you tell me about the decision-making and the rationale behind waiting until now to make it mandatory to undergo a 14-day self-quarantine rather than a week and a half ago?
There was a requirement from the very beginning, instructions given to Canadians returning that they needed to self-isolate for 14 days. And many, many, many of them did. Canadians have been following the instructions and the rules and the guidelines set out by public health, because they know it's about protecting their own safety, protecting that of their loved ones, and protecting the integrity and the health of people who work in our healthcare system. Unfortunately, there have been too many people who have not, and that's why we have to take this further step of making quarantine mandatory and bringing in enforcement measures as well.
And one of the challenges is enforcement with self-mandatory quarantine. Are you asking people to report if they see someone breaking the rules or the law?
Public health will be following up in many, many cases to ensure that people are following these rules, and enforcement will happen as enforcement does, as in various ways by our police and enforcement officers.
Okay. So essentially the Prime Minister saying we were doing what we were being told to do at the time, and now we're stepping it up with the quarantine being put in place now. I think when we get this ministerial news conference in the next